Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And I'm joined today by Paul. Paul, can you please share a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. Paul Powers. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Physna. Physna is a weird name. It's short for physical DNA. And what we do is we analyze 3D models and basically create a bridge between what's physical and digital by turning those 3D models into code so that you can understand the physical world just as well as you can understand text.
Hmm. And tell me a little bit about your generative AI journey.
So what we've been doing at Physna is we don't really actually like we did build a prototype for generative AI, and actually we
Hmm.
got an investment out of a large tech company
Nice.
not long after showing that we were able to generate true three-dimensional, like true 3D
Hmm.
models, not like a Nerf or a Gaussian where you just have like the outside, but actually the internal geometry, et cetera,
Hmm.
and at the right scale and measurements, off of a small training data set. And we showed them that the reason we were able to do it wasn't because we created some kind of new AI model or anything. It was because we were able to analyze, we were able to extract more data out of the
Hmm.
3D models because of how we analyze them.
Hmm.
But aside from that prototype, what we've been doing is helping companies by taking the data that they have and
Hmm.
analyzing it. Basically, again, turning that 3D model and 3D models into code and being able to
Hmm.
find commonalities, differences, finding the correlations between not only the 3D models to each other and their components to each other, but also things like, the metadata that's about these
Hmm.
models. We can figure out things like how do these parts get manufactured? How should this part be
Hmm.
manufactured? How might it perform in the field? And what that allows the
Hmm.
companies to do is do a combination of analytical AI, right, to make
Hmm.
predictions around what they should design, how they can procure parts, where they should buy parts from, how they should manufacture them, but also if they want to do generative, to use generative trained on their own data set. And even if
Hmm.
they only have maybe 10, 20, 100,000 models, it can be enough actually to do
Hmm.
generative in their specific field.
So take me for a project, from the start of a project, the early stages, through the mid stages, and through the late stages and the completion. What would a typical project look like that involves both analytical AI, so machine learning, and generative AI?
Sure. So, without going into any details of any specific
Yes.
customers, what we would do is instead of taking a large training data set and trying to build something that's generalized, the problem that you have in 3D when you're working with customers that
Hmm.
need to create parts or analyze parts that are specific to a specific domain, let's say say a random aerospace company that makes
Hmm.
parts for jets, they're going to want something very different when if they ask for someone to generate a brake pad or a braking system than somebody
Hmm.
who's in the automotive sector creating parts for cars, right? So
Hmm.
you don't want that to be too generalized because and the worst thing you can have is a mixture of both, right? That's not going to work for
Hmm.
anybody. So it's important that you're training off of data sets that are specific to an industry, but what you can do
Hmm.
that's even better is training off data sets that are specific to that company. And then,
Hmm.
and so where analytical and generative kind of overlap is you actually kind of need one for the other. If
Hmm.
to do the other one well, if I just say, hey, create let's go back to the aerospace company. If I say, hey, create a plane that has enough room for 300 passengers, okay, well, that's very basic. It's unrealistically
Hmm.
basic, right? It might work in a video game setting, but it doesn't work
Hmm.
for, manufacturing. And so before you can get there, what you need to do is really understand what all of that means, right? So be
Hmm.
able to analyze all the models that they have and say, okay, this is what you mean when your specific company says,
Hmm.
a plane that has XYZ features. This is what that means. Typically, you're not going to be working on something like generating a plane from in generative. You're going to be generating parts or components or
Hmm.
optimizing something, right? So to understand how to optimize something, like say I want to have
Hmm.
a I don't know, a fuel valve that is more wear resistant, that is under a certain weight, right? Maybe that hits certain parameters or thresholds. Well, the only way to
Hmm.
do that is to be able to look at the previous data they have and look at what were the things that caused, some fuel valves to have those certain attributes and what
Hmm.
and other fuel valves to not have that. And what we find is that it's almost always a combination of really just two types of things. One being obviously the metadata, right? So,
Hmm.
the written information about the part. That's the easy part. But then the where we specialize is then finding the correlations between that and the
Mm.
geometry and saying, well, okay, if I don't know, I'm making things up here to keep the
Sure.
example, anonymized and random, but maybe the if it's a fuel valve, maybe certain pressures can are correlate to wall thicknesses, and
Mm.
certain materials correlate to certain weights, right? And certain
Mhm.
geometry might correlate to certain weights, and so it allows you to understand you need to be able to make predictions about parts for that company first
Mhm.
before you can reliably start to actually be trusted for anything that's generative for that
Mm.
company. So a use case starts to front to back might be you ingest the data for the company, you analyze the information,
Mhm.
they immediately get value even before you can make some of the more advanced predictions because they can
Mm.
see you can deduplicate parts for them, you can find alternative vendors for them and
Mm.
suppliers for them, which can help if you're dealing with tariffs, for example, right? You need to find new suppliers, and it can also help the engineers speed up the design process because they don't have to
Mhm.
start from scratch if
Mm.
they can find what they're designing faster, and then you get this immediate wave of benefits, and then after you've ingested enough data about those parts, then you can find the correlations between not just the geometry but the geometry and those attributes. Then you go to the analytical AI part, and so now you can make wiser decisions about how you're going to build aircraft,
Mm.
and then soon after that you've already sped up the engineering process, but if you wanted to do
Mhm.
generative, it could be that you're helping a designer um, generate something that has a very specific attribute that they don't have to maybe start from scratch
Mhm.
if you have enough parts you've designed in the past where you could deduce essentially what the right combination of factors would be for a new part. So all of that can happen in the same
Mhm.
system, but it normally would go in that order.
Now, okay, so I understand the order. You're talking about designers and engineers, and so what you're doing is in some ways replacing some of the work they used to do with the work of not only analytical AI but generative AI, kind of creativity, innovation. How do people feel about that? What's their response? Tell me a little bit more about that.
So it's th- the wisest people I know embrace it, and the people who
Mm.
are there are people who are guarded. Typically
Mm.
not at companies. Typically when I have conversations with people in public about this, I get that question a lot, which is like, "Well, are you
Mm.
replacing their work?" I'm like, when you go to these companies and you explain how you're able to help them,
Mm.
the engineers typically aren't thinking, "Oh, you're taking my job." What they think is, "Oh, you're making my job way easier, and you're
Mm.
allowing me to get more done." Because,
Mm.
in a nutshell, like if we're able to prevent them from redesigning the same thing from scratch, if that makes your job obsolete, that's a bad thing because you don't want someone redesigning something from scratch
Mm.
because that means that they're going to create a duplicate, which is going to cause all kinds of problems down the road, right? So instead, what you want to do is make sure that instead of recreating the wheel,
Mm.
perhaps literally, they're actually creating something new. They're doing something creative,
Mm.
and instead of having to design 400 things and finding out which one of them is actually going to work. What we're doing is we're helping to guide them and say, well, it looks
Mm.
like based off of what you've designed in the past, this kind of design tended to perform really well, and that kind of design
Mm.
tended not to. So you're not replacing the role of an engineer, but what
Mm.
you're doing is you're making them operate at their full capacity, at their full potential,
Mm.
and be a lot more impactful. So I really don't believe that what we're doing is making people obsolete. It's just making
Mm.
them more capable, making them able to make faster, more accurate and better decisions more rapidly.
Now, as people are learning to use this new digital technology, analytical AI, generative AI, what do you find are the best practices for people to actually learn it effectively? Because you have especially people who are older and who are experienced in doing things in a different fashion, may be more manually. It might be hard for them to pick up this technology. What do you find as the best practices for people who are picking up this technology and doing so in the most effective, quick fashion?
It's a great question. Actually, I regularly when we talk about this at the company, I kind of have this motto, which is that if we have to spend too long training somebody, we've messed up, right?
Mm.
You shouldn't have to. It shouldn't be a massive learning curve to understand how to use
Mm.
these new technologies. The biggest breakthroughs in history, from a technological perspective, were shockingly intuitive to do, right? So the
Mm.
reason that the internet there's a small learning curve with it, but not massive. Personal computers became relatively easy. The iPhone's about as straightforward of a user interface as you can get. You just literally touch what you want,
Mm.
and then but that's still input for output. And but what we're seeing increasingly is that you don't even have to navigate systems anymore. Like when you use ChatGPT, how big's the menu? there's not a menu. You just
Yeah.
say what you want, and it's conversational, like having a conversation with a human. That's ultimately what every user experience should really
Mm.
be like. Now, when you're talking about like these complicated processes for
Mhm.
design, we don't want to jump the gun there too quickly. So we are working on like, hey, how do we make it more conversational? How do we make it more automated?
Mm.
But of course, you can't have that at the expense of precision, right? Being able to say, no,
Mm.
no, no, I'm talking about this part. I don't want to have to spend half an hour talking to an engine explaining what I could just click on, right? So you have to find that balance. But you shouldn't have to work too hard to understand how to use the tools
Mhm.
I'm trying to say. The biggest hurdle isn't that the tools are complicated. At least for our tool, I mean, I can teach you how to use Physna in less than a minute. It's very,
Mm.
very intuitive. You click on what you want it to do. It's not hard. It's more just becoming acquainted with all that it's capable of doing than anything else. Um, the bigger hurdle is trusting. Trust is the wrong word. I guess daring to try something new, right? I don't
Mm.
want people to trust us blindly. I can give
Mm.
them all the science and the logic behind why what we do is accurate, but we
Mm.
also display the confidence level. We display exactly how similar two different parts are, exactly how
Mm.
why we're seeing the correlations. So what we're trying to do is get over the trust gap. And so we find that people don't feel like they have to go out on a limb to trust our decisions. The biggest hurdle is
Mm.
really just people saying, okay, this is something I've never done before. Let me give it a shot. And what they'll find is that
Mm.
they'll be more productive,
Mm.
kind of speaks for
Now,
itself.
mm. As we finish up, where do you see generative AI of the kind that we're talking about here going in the next 2, 3, 4 years? What do you see as the next evolution?
Think you're going to see a combination of a couple of things, and especially if you're talking 3, 4 years out, that's a very long
Yeah.
time in AI terms, right? So I think in that time frame, we will see true AGI, artificial general
Mm.
intelligence. I might argue that you could already be at ASI, artificial superintelligence, or at least getting close to it, right? Maybe not every person will have access to that, but it's going to look increasingly achievable. Um, on a simpler, less, abstract level, what you'll start to see is that the AI's tools would become slightly more generalized, and that the tools won't you won't
Mhm.
need to use a specialized design tool. If you ask ChatGPT to go design something for you, it typically doesn't do very well. You need to go use something different, right? So you'll probably start to see these tools become a little bit less specialist in general,
Mm.
except when you're dealing with some really complicated things like what we're doing. I think that that'll still be somewhat um, specialized, but a better way to say it might be the specialized tools will feel more generalized, right? You'll be like,
Mm.
for us, I expect that you'll be able to choose if you wanted to use, the traditional way of designing or traditional menus for procurement, et cetera, or if you just wanted to literally have a conversation with your computer
Mm.
and it does everything in the background. I think that's what's going to happen on one end. The other thing
Well,
is that I think what we're doing, we're lucky because of the technology we have just lends itself really well to allowing
mm.
companies to very quickly get AI benefits out of a training data set that's very small and unique to that company. But I think that you'll start to see that in other industries as well, right? Where, you something like a chat GPT will be much more so than today, much more tuned to
Mm.
you, right? Much
Mm.
more aware of your preferences, things that matter to you, and have a much deeper understanding of what you're looking for
Mhm.
when you ask a question versus what the average person is looking for when they ask a
Mm.
question. I think that's going to become increasingly common. And then two other things, I think you're going to see AI
Mhm.
a lot more intersecting with the physical world. I don't just mean with 3D models like we have it, but also something else that we built is an integration with augmented reality headsets. And so what
Mm.
you'll see more of coming from us and probably from others too, is you'll have this interface between, the physical world and the digital one that we experience. And then and lastly, you'll start to see more instead of input for output, like, hey, do
Mhm.
this, and then, okay, here you go, it being more predictive, right? In the sense that
Mm.
if I typically ask for the weather report when I'm putting on my coat and walking outside, and this won't require augmented reality, but just let's just use this example because it's simple. I put on my AR headset. They probably look just like these glasses at some point, maybe not in 3 years, but certainly not far from that, and it knows I'm putting on my coat. Well, typically, if I put on my coat, I want to know what the weather is outside. Let's just say that's what I do. instead of saying me asking what's the weather outside, it'll automatically tell you, Here's the weather outside,
Mm,
by the way. I know you're going to ask me about this, and I'm going to go ahead and start your car for you because I know that you're
mm,
going to want to start the car, right? And I think you're going to start seeing it become more proactive. You already can see that a little
mm,
bit, right? On your
mm.
phone. It kind of guesses when you open up your iPhone what app you probably are wanting to use that time of day. You're going to start seeing that become a lot more proactive versus reactive.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Paul. I really appreciate your expertise. That was super helpful.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. It helps other people discover the show and helps us improve the show. If you have any questions, email me at gleb, Gleb, at disasteravoidanceexperts.com.